All right. Hey guys, welcome to the I Hope They Hear This podcast. And today's podcast is a huge treat for me because the person that we have on, actually, we don't really know each other personally, but we got connected through Jonathan Choi. So shout outs to Jonathan. But I was really interested in having you on because you were the host of the Growing Family podcast.
Yeah, that's a podcast my wife and I started after a few just life experiences, and we can get into more about that a little bit later.
But I think, if you're listening to this podcast, definitely recommend you go listen to all of the episodes, starting from episode 1, because man, I will say that it's the most emotional podcast I've ever listened to.
Yeah, it gets pretty thick. For the content and the journey to have gotten there wasn't what we had originally intended.
Yeah.
But just different events that have happened and the different things that God used in our life at the time, just kind of made episode 1 just be kind of our story. Mm-hmm. And we were really looking forward to sharing kind of what our growing family looks like, but this was kind of part of our process.
Right. So before we get into that, so please welcome Andrew Song into the podcast. Oh, Pastor Andrew Song.
Yeah. Sometimes. Yeah.
So, but before we get into the growing family, can you just give us a brief intro to who you are, what you do?
Yeah. So I grew up in kind of this neck of the woods. So it was like Johns Creek, a suburb of Atlanta. Me and David actually went to the same high school. We connected earlier, and we realized I think there was about 2 years overlap there. You had started when it first opened?
Yeah. So
your freshman year?
I was the first class to do all 4 years.
Oh, that's right. So I was only there for my junior and senior year.
Okay.
But yeah, I grew up in this area, and then I went to Illinois for undergrad and grad school to become a pastor. And then in 2013, me and my wife got married, which ended up bringing me back to Atlanta, serving at our church, 4 Points in Dunwoody. And that really is what kind of brought me back. And, fast forward, we were married, and my wife's going to kill me because I always forget the dates and the years. But we were married for probably close to 5 years before we had gotten pregnant. And that kind of like sparked really the journey of podcasting and so on and so forth. But even through the years kind of leading up to it, I got into it probably the same as you. There's content out there, commutes, and just learning more things online. And so I thought, hey, this is a great way to be creative, great way to dialogue and communicate with just, friends and peers, but also, people out there. And different subjects and stuff. And so as I was driving over here, actually, I was listening to the recap of 2019, just kind of a Spark Notes version, I guess, of the past year. Because, man, 52 episodes is a lot.
Yeah.
And so kudos to you for finishing that commitment. And so I was and it was a similar sort of sentiment in terms of podcasting. Is that, and you use the word curating, and I love that word because I think it's just like intentional organization with a purpose to, tell a story and to share some sort of moment with people. Yeah. And I found this to be a great intersection of all those things. And so, when Jonathan, I met him at Shabu Shabu, and then he told me, he was just like, hey, I have this friend named David who does this podcast. And I was able to kind of become a fan from afar because a lot of the guests that you had, like Ben and Selena and them, used to come to our church. And so those things just kind of floated around social media.
Yeah.
And I was like, man, this is awesome to see. Obviously being, Asian American, Korean American, being creative, that was one of those things that I started to appreciate once I started podcasting. And so, I connected with Jonathan, and he had said, hey, I think he'd be interested. And I was like, for sure, let's do it.
Yeah.
Because I always love, just talking and kind of sharing. And I think we have a similar idea in the sense, like, you put a mic in front of people, they get a little bit more authentic, a little bit more genuine.
Right.
For some reason, maybe it's because people don't realize like other people are listening to it. But it's just fun. Yeah, it's a great time, and so sure. I'm thankful to be here and obviously share my story and
thank you,
and plug whatever it is that might be coming in 2020.
Yeah. So. The timing worked out really well with you and Jonathan because I think literally the day before you saw him, I was talking to him actually on this couch right here. We were just hanging out and we were talking, and he was asking me about like future guests and just throwing out ideas.
Yeah.
And I knew that he knew you.
Yeah.
And I just threw out, it would be awesome to have Andrew on just to kind of get an update on his life, what's happened since the events of the first season of The Growing Family. And he was like, yeah, I'll reach out. And I didn't think it would happen so fast, but literally the day after, he texted me, hey, Andrew's going to contact you. So that worked out really well.
Well, part of it is because I love doing this. Oh, okay. And not necessarily because, I like talking, but more than anything else, I think there's a story and there's a connection people make, whether in their car or wherever it is that people will take in podcast content. But I think there is a value in sharing stories, and similarly to what you were sharing, is that when you can talk about the things that people don't normally talk about. And I love that you said, there's a certain, when you're hosting, you have this authority to be able to ask questions. Yeah. And that's absolutely right on. You have this opportunity to talk to people in a way that you wouldn't necessarily do at Starbucks or over dinner, and there's no small talk. You can get right into it because the expectation is there. And so when that happened, I was like, yeah, I'd love sitting and talking and hearing about your experience with this, as well as we kind of restart or start to process through, okay, what does 2020 look like for us in the world of podcasts?
Ooh.
But little teaser.
Yeah.
That's a little teaser.
I like that. We're definitely going to talk about that a little bit later.
For sure. Yeah, but for people who are listening, just to give you a little bit of background of the genesis of the podcast. But like I mentioned, me and my wife got married in 2013. And then about 4 years later, in 2017, we found out we were pregnant, which was kind of a surprise. We weren't trying or anything like that. And that was always kind of the posture we had. But yeah, we got pregnant. A lot of people around us were having kids or had kids. And so right around June is when we found out we were pregnant. And so we had a March delivery date. And we were just kind of going through that journey. And I was learning what is it going to be like to be a new dad. And at the turn of the year in January, I decided with just kind of my men's group, this is an idea that floated around in my mind. And so because of that, we're going to get started in January. What was that? 2017, I think it was. If I'm wrong with the years, you can listen to it and get it more precise.
Yeah.
But it was a January. And so we went out, we bought all the equipment, put the mics together and got it ready. And so the goal was to be able to kind of document the final month leading up to the delivery.
Wow.
And be able to, let the world know hey, we're expecting, these are our stresses. And my hope is to be able to kind of talk through real conversations about what does it look like to become a new dad. I got a chance to meet your daughter downstairs. And so I'm sure what that looks like right before delivery. And then unfortunately, I believe it was February, again, I'm bad with dates, but it was early February where we actually lost our first, who was a boy. It was 36 weeks or 7 weeks. Again, Mimi is much better at these dates. But yeah, basically what I tell people, in the last 2 minutes, the 2-minute drill, unfortunately we had lost. And so had a stillbirth. And what that means is our son had died in the womb. It was a Tuesday, and I remember it distinctly. I was at staff lunch at church. Get a call from Mimi and answer it, and she's just broken. She's just bawling. I'm like, hey, what's going on? Stepped out, and she told me that we had lost Eunhyung, which is his name. And then from there, it was just a roller coaster of figuring out what was next. Yeah. And so fast forward a little bit, and I forget when we released the first episode. I think it was probably towards the tail end of February. My wife and I really talked. It's like, hey, do we still do this?
Right, because the title is The Growing Family.
Yeah,
right.
And the hope was the podcast would be about sharing struggles, talking with friends. What does it look like to be a new dad? What are the ups and downs? And I realize this now, having an 11th-month-old now, is saying hey, what is it like the days that you hate being a dad? Questions that you don't really ask, but everybody kind of goes through. That was the intent, but then all of a sudden we have this loss that is kind of unbelievable. And then I looked at Mimi, and it was actually surprising to me. She was just like, hey, you know what? This is something we have to do. God put it in our life, and this is something that, this is something God wanted for you to do. Yeah. And so with that, we actually started kind of with a showstopper, I guess you could say, because we have this Growing Family podcast, and the first thing is talking about our loss. Yeah. And so I think the first 2 or 3 episodes is about the journey and the immediate steps that have happened. So we lost, and then we had to deal with the events leading up to it, the birth, and then the funeral and all of those things.
Yeah.
And so, and so that's how we ended up kicking off the podcast. And then we went through a few episodes, and we had some friends come on and talk about their story, talk about, their marriages and their dating and stuff like that. It was funny, and I feel like I can say this now, but we had Abe and Jess, who are mutual friends of ours. There was a part that he was saying that he was going to propose by the end of the year.
Oh.
And then I said, dude, it was like, wow, that's like huge. It's like you're putting it out there.
Yeah.
He texted me later, and he actually said, hey, can you edit that out? I wasn't 100% sure. I forgot if I did or not. I may have. But that's like behind the curtain. Like, for me, I didn't want to edit anything, but he was just like, hey, can you take it out?
No, I think you did edit it out because I don't remember.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah, and so we had a couple friends come on. I had a couple of different things, episodes lined up to kind of help go through the process. Wanted to talk to people about infertility, loss, miscarriages, and other things like that. Because at the end of the day, that's still part of, your growing family. And one of the blessings of it was kind of that conversation being opened up.
Right. And the kind of compelling part of your story is, the story itself, you guys are so open and vulnerable about it that it's so raw. So in the day and age of highlights, like people's highlights in social media, for you guys to just open up and say, hey, this happened, it was like a breath of fresh air for me. And the crazy part is that your wife is a midwife.
She is, yeah.
And so like she's in the profession of bringing babies into the world for other women.
Yeah.
And for what happened, the stillbirth, for it to happen to her, like what are the chances, right?
Yeah, I mean having a stillbirth is very low, right? But then for the mom to be a midwife, that was a lot of counseling. There was a lot of therapy through that. Like I remember the week or two leading up to her going back to work was huge because we didn't know how she was going to react. We didn't know what it was going to be. And I think we had mentioned it or we had talked about it. I'd have to go back and listen, but it wasn't easy. Like it was hard. After her first delivery, she had to go into a room and had to just kind of cry.
Wow.
And just kind of deal with the pain because it was so in her face.
Yeah.
And then her practice really did a lot in terms of protecting her and hedging it a little bit.
Yeah.
But you can't stay away from it forever, especially in her business, in her industry.
Right. I think you mentioned that her hospital, the clinic? Yeah. They handed out pamphlets to say.
Yeah, there's a little note that they gave to patients.
Yeah.
Like this was like probably like the week or 2 weeks after, mentioning that, hey, your physician, your healthcare provider suffered a loss in X, Y, and Z, and that we were very appreciative of that.
Yeah,
them being kind of respectful through the whole process.
It's through your podcast and your story that I realized. So you know how they say don't tell people about your pregnancy for the first 3 months. Like I don't know if it's like a Korean thing or not, but yeah, I had that, and I never understood that. I always thought, why? Like if you know you're pregnant, why not celebrate it with people?
Yeah.
But you guys mentioned how it's one thing dealing with the actual loss, but having to be constantly reminded by people asking, oh, what happened to your baby? Or did you have your baby?
Yeah.
Like you were talking about how difficult that was.
Yeah, it's tough. And surprisingly enough, and obviously as you have, you may have friends who are married and are trying as well. People don't talk because at least within the first 8 weeks, I believe, it's still very, I don't want to say up in the air, and I'm not a professional by any stretch, but what I've learned through it is that people are hesitant because miscarriaging, that's not even a real word. Miscarriages are so common.
Yeah.
But with people, like for new moms, especially first-time moms who suffer through miscarriage, it's a tough topic because you get the excitement of having a child, and all of a sudden, wherever you might land on the spectrum of life or whatever, you're readying yourself for this next season of life, and all of a sudden it's taken away.
Yeah.
And what I realized through the process is that that's what it felt like. Like we were given this opportunity, and it was almost like a given, and then it was taken away from us.
Right. Well, in your situation though, it's 8 months. Most people think you're in the clear by then, right?
Which I would say you are. So if there are any people who are pregnant in their 8th month or 37th, 38th week, it is uncommon, right? Like something has to happen. And Mimi tells me, or she had mentioned through some experiences that she's heard where they go in for delivery and they lose a child because the umbilical cord. There's a lot of it's just like up in the air. And I think there's two sides of the coin. I think yes, you can expect to have a child, but on the other side of the coin, it's still a miracle every time a child comes in, no matter how many times it happens, or no matter how many people you meet who've had healthy children. Like every single one is still a miracle, because so many. And this is something that my wife would, it's a testimony for her, and that so many body systems have to work together to bring life into this world, and God orchestrates it perfectly. And it's not easy by any stretch, right? But it's such a perfect balance of things that even the slightest misstep could cause such a devastation, which is something that we suffer through, But at the end, it happens. It happens more than we would think, And the one thing, if I would say there is a blessing, is that because of our story, putting it out there, and us being at a place where God really moved and worked in our life so clearly, that it gave people the courage to be like, what, I struggled with this. Thanks for telling me your story. Now, I can deal with the 2 miscarriages or the 3 miscarriages in the first 5 years of our marriage. And people always ask, like, oh, hey, are you thinking about children? And you forget behind the curtain, like, we have been, but we've been struggling through it, and so on and so forth. Right. And I think we take it for granted. Because it's just one of those things that I guess just happens. But one of the things that I realize is that, what, it's not as clear cut as a lot of people would think. Not to say like pregnancy is something we should be afraid of. But on the other side, it taught me to understand, like, people who've been married like 6-7 years. I shouldn't assume like, oh, they're not wanting kids. But like there could be 4 years that they've been going through like IVF or other means of, other things. And I just helped grow our compassion and grace towards people and their stories, and hearing that. And that's probably been the best part of it all. Right.
Actually for me as a listener too, I think I got much more sensitive toward the topic because if in your case, it's kind of crazy because she was like showing and everything, but I'm sure people go through it before they show.
Oh yeah.
Right. So we never know what's going on, kind of behind closed doors. So to be insensitive and throw topics out there like, oh, you guys must not want babies because you haven't had a baby yet. Like that could come off extremely insensitive to a couple who is actually trying, right?
And I think people who go and suffer through that, they understand because, I think we've all been there. But what has taught me and kind of moving forward is that, we had our loss and then we went through counseling and we were kind of really struggling through it. But in 2018, June, again, we found out we were pregnant, which is kind of, that's how we closed out the first season. And I kind of restarted the second one, which was like, hey, we're going through this process all over again, and dealing it with the second time had its ups and downs as well. And so, thankful to God in February of 19, we ended up being able to deliver our daughter, which has been crazy.
When I think I heard that you guys were pregnant when you guys were on the KTL podcast.
Yes.
For the first time, and I was like super excited because I felt like you guys were a part of my life because I was listening to your podcast. Yes. But can I ask you a question? So I know this is a sensitive topic, so if there's anything that I'm saying that you don't want to talk about, please just But
we'll edit it out. That's how we podcast.
But you mentioned counseling. So how long was that process?
So we went to see a counselor specifically who dealt with trauma and grief, and I would suggest it to everyone, whether you go through grief or trauma, or whether you are feeling good, like putting mental health at a top priority is one of those things. Like, rather than wait till something happens, like you're able to kind of build a tool belt to kind of help figure out and navigate through life. Right. And so whether you're married or single, finding somebody and finding a regular rhythm in talking through just like stress. And I know that you were talking about anxiety, and you had Andy on, who's actually been a longtime friend. I've known, me and Andy were in the same Korean class back when we were, he may know better, but it was like 5th or 6th grade. We were young.
Wow.
So I've known him for a good bit.
Okay.
Yeah, kind of talking with somebody, meeting with somebody, I would probably suggest somebody that you don't know, just to be able to hear from them,
right?
From them, like not an unbiased, but like, there's no baggage there,
right?
Like they're really coming at you and saying like, listen, I'm learning and hearing your story, kind of sort of in a vacuum, and here are some questions and other things like that. And so we went to Summit Counseling, which is a Christian counseling center that was fantastic for us. And I'll be honest, the first session, I left and I was just like, man, did I just pay for this? And she was just asking my name and story. I was like, we'll give it a try or whatever. Man, the second session I went in there, left bawling.
Wow.
And then she was like, I'm sorry, we're running out of time. You're going to have to talk next week. And I was like, oh my God, this is crazy. And so through that, what I realized is that they began to ask me questions that I didn't even realize I needed to ask. But then they also asked me the questions that I didn't want to ask myself.
Wow.
Right? Like, I remember one time they were talking about like, okay, how are you and Mimi doing? And she had mentioned to me like, do you recognize that you busying yourself is actually hurting her? And I was like, man, I had no idea like what that looks like. And that only happened because we were talking about, I guess how we were feeling or how we were processing through things. And so, yeah, I would highly suggest it to everyone. Whether it's once a month, once a quarter, like putting it in your rhythm, because having that person be able to kind of unpack and like pick up the stones and the sticks in your life and your heart will always be more beneficial at the end of the day. So
you're the second person to suggest that on this podcast. Selena, when she was on, she also suggested.
Yeah.
Everyone go through like
everybody.
Counseling. Wow.
And I think Korean Americans, Asian Americans feel like, oh, if I'm seeing a therapist, like something's wrong with me.
Right.
The truth is there is something wrong. Like there's always something wrong with us. We're like dealing with, stress, and as immigrant children, there's like so many layers and stuff like that. Yeah. Like, yeah, we should be seeing them. So I say that in jest, but in reality, I think it's a tough journey already. Like, why not get some extra hands and help?
Right.
And I understand the financial cost. Like, that's huge. But like when you start to prioritize certain things, I think it makes sense.
Yeah. Wow. And so how long do you think with counseling, how long do you think the grief, I'm sure still, if you think about it, there's grief there.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Like, how long do you think it was before you felt like kind of you were back into the normal rhythm of things? Or is it always just going to be?
What I realized is after our loss and after our counseling sessions, the biggest thing that I realized, like, it's never going to be the same, right? Like everything is going to be different.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of times people will want to be like, okay, I've gone through an event and then I just want things back to the way it was. Wow. But I realized the reality is I carry this scar with me. Like we always get cuts and bruises and stuff like that, whether it's cosmetic or on the surface or, unfortunately it can be even bigger. These are just things that we end up having to deal with, but it gives us the fabric of our stories and narratives. And so once I think Mimi and I realized, like, we're not trying to go back to being people who didn't have kids, but it was just like, okay, can we be a married couple who has a loss in our family and are just now living according to that experience, right? Like a good example is when we found out we were pregnant, we ended up buying a home. We were renting for a few years and we thought we were going to rent forever because we didn't want to be locked down or so on and so forth. And then we found out we had a kid and we were like, okay, priorities change. And so we ended up buying a townhouse in Smyrna. So my next question was, okay, should we sell this because we don't need it anymore?
Oh, wow.
But then what counseling helped me realize is like, no, it's not that you're going back. It's like, okay, how do we move forward? Carrying this sort of baggage or carrying this part of your story in a way in which, changes and transforms you in a positive way at the end of the day, right? And so I think once we were able to come to that conclusion, not to say we didn't need to go anymore, but I think the grief and the trauma, like the pain of that, like subsided. And so now it was about, okay, how do we like live our life healthy now?
Right.
after we did our like therapy and our like recovery process, like how now do we get back into it? I will say I mean, looking back on the past year, I was like, maybe it would have been smarter at least to keep it within our rhythm of once a month, or, you know, just so that we have this person in a relationship. But yeah, as we moved into 2020, that's another thing me and my wife were talking about. Like, hey, we should should get back, because of the fact that we're having to deal with so many newer things.
Right.
And advocating for counseling and seeing a therapist. Like, I know I need that for myself as well. So,
that's so good. So it's not about how can I repair my life to get back to what it was before, but recognizing the trauma and the hurt and moving forward with it, right?
I think so, because now, for instance, like we had our second, or so we have our daughter, which was our second pregnancy, first child. When I look at her, I don't look at her as my first child, if that makes sense.
Right. Yeah.
Because we had one, we had lost him. So to a certain extent, like, she is our second. And I think that only happens because I wasn't trying to erase our first with her. And that was really tough. Like, that was a big obstacle, because I wanted for her to fill the gaps. And I was quickly able to realize, like, if I did that, then I would be shortchanging maybe her experience with me as her dad. I wouldn't want for her to feel like, oh, you know, I'm second to this child that he didn't have.
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
Right.
And so now, like, when I tell people, like, oh, I have a daughter, and they ask, oh, is that your only one? You know, I try not to like ruin the mood, but at the same time, I let them know, like, oh, you know, we were pregnant before, but we had a loss, and so this is our second, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And sometimes it works. Sometimes I'm tired, so I'll just be like, yeah, it's my first, you know. But mentally, that was the big obstacle that I think God really revealed through counseling. It was like this is another child, this is another experience, and so we have this the outfit that I talked about. I think it was like the first episode that we framed. Like, we still keep that up, like, kind of in the middle of our kitchen, and it's not something we look at every single day. But it also is a reminder of like where we are now. You know what I'm talking about? And so. And it's part of like our growing as a family as well.
So then, again, I understand this is a very sensitive topic, so please feel free to shut down any questions I might ask.
Never.
But like, growing up, so what was your daughter's name?
Her name is Unbi.
Unbi, okay. Like, Unbi, how are you gonna navigate, you know, talking to her about this older brother that she has that she's never met? Like, have you guys thought about that?
We did, and that's a great question. I don't know. At the end of the day, if somebody knows, if somebody's gone through that and you know, has advice, please let me know. But when my wife and I talked about it, I think we are hoping that when she sees that frame, she's gonna ask, "Hey, like, Appa, what is that frame?" And that hopefully gives me an opportunity to be like, "Listen, like, let me tell you the story." Right. Like, me and your mom. We're going to have a baby, but unfortunately he's in heaven, who's your bigger brother that you will eventually get to meet, you know. I mean, I don't know if I have to get into heaven and hell and all of that at that moment, but it's just kind of creating that space for her to realize. And I mean, I hope to be able to have that conversation with her well. But also I know both Mimi and I are ready to tell her of that story. Does that make sense? I wouldn't want to hold that back from her. Because then she would be the only person who doesn't know. And I wouldn't want that to be the case. And so the wording, I'm not sure how that is. So again, it may come out that way. It may come out terribly, but yeah, it's definitely something we want for her to know as she grows up. I was
just actually really curious about, because I don't know what the right answer is. I don't know what's best for the child, but I could imagine two things happening. A different set of parents might think it's best for her not to know about it.
Of course,
Right? So,
and I think that's a judgment call. You know, I think every family is going to make that discernment to say, like, hey, we want to talk about it, we don't. Which I don't know if it's the right way. I don't think it's the wrong way, but again, every family is going to be different, and you know, if people have wisdom, I'd love to hear that. And so, I'm not sure when that's going to happen, but I think it'll eventually happen in the near future.
Yeah.
The way that, time flies with kids.
Right. Yeah. But, I think as a person, if my parents withheld information from me about, like a brother that I had who's now no longer here, I think I would be upset like later on in life.
Sure, you feel like you missed out on something.
Yeah, like why wasn't I told like this?
Yeah.
So okay. Oh, this.
But I don't know if that changes her dynamic, because I don't know how that changes the sibling dynamic.
Right.
There's so much like uncertainty because I don't know how that would work.
Mm-hmm.
So would she still like portray eldest child,
Like the
tendencies, personalities and stuff like that? I mean, probably not, but those are questions that are still up in the air.
Wow.
Yeah.
And so there's one thing that you guys talked about on the podcast, that when you have a miscarriage like that, the chances of having another miscarriage in the future go up, right?
Yeah.
So how did you guys get over that fear? Because I'm sure when you experience something like that, the last thing you want to do is have to experience it again.
Yeah.
But you guys, despite that, had a second child. Was that something you guys had to kind of struggle through?
Yeah. So the pregnancy, that second pregnancy we had was, that was the lingering thought every day, right? Anytime Mimi called me at a weird time, like there was a little bit of hesitation, right? She's like, oh man, what is this? But again, I go back to the counseling sessions, because there was one session where we dealt with that. Like she was like, what are you most afraid of? I was like, I'm afraid to lose this child because it happened before. Now it's on the table, right? Like if it didn't happen, then you're not necessarily thinking about it. But because it is, now it's an option, or like you've gone through that experience. And I remember our counselor had looked at us and asked us, hey, what if everything went well? How would that make you feel? And I'd be like, that'd be fantastic. Like if I knew like everything was gonna be great, then I wouldn't be gripped with fear. I wouldn't be anxious every time I went to the doctors or anytime like my wife called. And the advice that she gave us, or really a prescription for us, is the next time you feel that sort of fear, let it happen, but then rewrite the narrative. Like, don't dwell within the fact that you have a chance to lose this child, because in reality, you don't. Like, we don't know. The story hasn't been written.
Right.
So flipping the narrative in your mind, obviously it's true, like you're going to be thinking about it, but think about it, but say, you know what does the other side of the coin look like? It looks like we're going to have a healthy baby. We're going to have, a wonderful child raising experience. Like she's going to grow up, she's going to get married, and you're going to have grandkids. Like that narrative is just as true as it would be for us to lose the second one as well. You know what I'm talking about?
Right.
And so she had told us very clearly, like, the next time you feel it, before you come, like, make note of it, but then let me know how it goes by rewriting the narrative in your mind.
Wow.
And that was just like a practice that we had to do. And there were times where very early on where we'd be like getting ready for bed, and like we would just be gripped with emotion, right? Just thinking about it again. And then it triggered us. Be like, you know what does it look like if she was born healthy? Like, what would we name her? And start thinking about and talking about the other side of the reality. And I know some people would, and I think this is just human nature. Like, if you lower the expectations, there are like lower chances of being disappointed.
Right.
But then I realized at that point, like, that's just a crappy way of feeling.
Yeah.
If you're always gonna be like, oh, okay, this baby's gonna, like, I hate to be so brash about it, but it's like, the second baby's gonna die too. Like, that just kills your mood. That just kills everything.
Yeah.
Rather than dwelling in that, saying like, you know what does it look like if it was positive? Like, if everything was healthy? And that really did change a lot of things. And I actually take that into other moments that I am anxious, especially things that are out of my control. I just say, you know what? Let's say it does work out. What are the implications? What happens in my life if it does work out? And I start to like piece those things together.
Wow.
Because we're going to have to deal with the disappointment at some level, but I'd rather deal with it when it does happen, not let it consume my, let it consume the moments where it's out of my hands.
Right.
You know what I'm talking about?
Oh, that's so good.
Yeah. Because at the end of the day, like, having a child is completely out of your hands. Like, there's no, I mean, you can do the different things, but similar, like our experience, we don't know what happened. There wasn't any sort of clear indication of the loss. Like, was there like, Yeah, so there's no medical reasoning on why it happened.
Yeah.
It's frustrating, but at the same time, I'm thinking, you know what? It was out of my hands. Nothing we could have done.
Yeah.
So it gave us a little bit more comfort in that
Wow,
regards.
that's so good.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so when I first heard your podcast, it was literally a month before we found out we were pregnant.
Okay.
So when we were pregnant, your podcast was still fresh in our minds.
Wow. Yeah.
I think it helped us take every moment kind of as a precious time, right? Because you never know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
But one experience I had this was Christmas Eve of 2018. My wife woke up and she was like, I'm bleeding.
Yeah.
And so we went to the emergency room.
Yeah.
And the first thing I thought was the night before that, we kind of had an argument.
Okay.
And I started immediately blaming myself, saying, I stressed her out and this is why it happened. So
how far along was she at that point?
She was 4 months.
4 months. Okay.
Yeah. Oh, no. 3 to 4 months.
Okay.
Right around there.
Yeah.
So it's still kind of like in the unsure territory,
Yeah.
right? So as a parent, I feel like it's natural kind of to blame yourself when something like that happens. Did you guys have to kind of struggle with that?
Yeah, absolutely. You go through every scenario and every moment where, did we not eat well, or did we exercise too hard?
Wow.
Did we were we too active, or were we, did we travel too much? And, unfortunately, like my grandparents and my parents, I mean, like their intentions were great and so on and so forth. But sometimes they would say something like, maybe you guys shouldn't have gone on that trip or that last one, if you want to take like a mini or like a baby moon before the baby comes, it's like, maybe you shouldn't do that. Like we were in Iceland. So we took a trip to Iceland that was already booked before we found out we were pregnant.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was within what the doctors deemed as being a safe time.
Mm-hmm.
But we had done a couple of excursions, obviously we stayed away from like the really dangerous ones where she could have fallen.
Right.
But there were some sketchy moments where I was just like, man, if we finished this experience, like it could have been bad, And I think back to it, like as soon as it happened, I thought, man, was it Iceland? Oh. And that was my call. My wife's like, I feel like we're good, but if you don't feel comfortable, I was like, you know what, let's do it. We're in Iceland. You kind of justify some things.
Right.
And that's a burden, obviously, that you carry. Yeah. But the truth is, I think it's a narrative thing. Like I go back to, it's just like, I could say that it was my fault and deal with and blame myself, or it could have been something that was completely out of hand.
Right.
You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
And even and that's like the definition of an accident. You can't really control it.
Right.
Just it is what it is.
Yeah.
And you kind of deal with it as it comes.
Right. Mm-hmm. Wow. Thank you so much for being open. And for more details of Andrew and Mimi's journey in that, please go listen to their podcast. But I want to shift gears a little bit and kind of talk about your experience, kind of an update since the end, because you guys stopped releasing new episodes before the birth of your second child, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, I just want to hear, how has it been becoming a father?
I mean, it's, I think the best way that I could probably say is like it's quite the adventure, right? Like I look back on it, I would say like the first month and a half, first 2 months was like a blur. You're not getting sleep.
Yeah.
You're just kind of going through it. You have a 6 months, so it's fresher in your mind, but just like, man, I don't remember anything that happened, right? And then it just kind of progresses, and next thing I know, she's turning 1 next month.
Wow. Yeah.
And I'm like, man, where's the time gone? You know what I'm talking about? And so it's been great. One, we've been blessed with just having a very well sleeping and well eating baby. No allergies, which was huge.
That is huge.
And it's funny, like my wife, she probably wouldn't describe herself as like a prayer warrior. And I wouldn't it would be hard for me to describe her in that way because of the way that it's used. But there are two prayer movements in her life that she's made. One being that before she goes into work, she prays to God, like, Lord, allow for me not to have like any crazy people and no deaths. Right.
Yeah.
Like on the table or something of that regards.
Yeah.
And she's been protected from that ever since. Yeah. So every day she walks in and stuff, and it's been quite the blessing. The other thing is like, we pray for, no allergies and good sleep. And that's something that we've been blessed with, and we're super thankful for that.
Does she sleep through the night?
She does.
Wow.
She slept through the night fairly early.
What month?
Oh man. So I think about after week 4, we decided to move her into the nursery because I felt like I was just jailed in my bedroom. Yeah. Like you wake up, take care of her, go back to sleep.
Yeah.
I just never felt like I left. And so we ended up moving her. I would probably say around like the 6-week mark, we were getting like in the 6 hours of sleep.
Wow.
And and then there was some times where like we would put her down around like 9 or 10, and then she would wake up at like 6 or 7.
That's huge.
Huge. I felt like a new man. When it happened. And so like we started to kind of extend it a little bit, let her cry it out every so often, and like usually we put her down at 7:30. Depending on the day, we'll go in there at like 7:30, 8 o'clock. And so she'll like roll around and kind of play by herself, but she won't really cry out and stuff like that. Wow. And so I have a sense, if you are a new mom out there with like a baby who doesn't sleep well, I'm sorry. I just want to apologize to you because, I know to a certain extent, you're probably like cursing at me and being like, this guy doesn't know what he has. I trust me when I say I know exactly how blessed we are when it comes to that. And so, the past 11 months have just been figuring things out, figuring our rhythm, figuring out, what does it look like to raise our child. Yeah. And so I would probably say the past 2 months have been great just because developmentally she's like blossomed into this little child who communicates a little bit. Like she says appa. We taught her different things like clapping and hand motions and stuff like that. And she smiles, and we got her to inza every so often. So she says like she bows to like my parents when we prompt her to. That's and so cute. Yeah, it's such a fun time. Yeah. So she's like, I would probably say maybe like a month, 6 weeks out from possibly walking. Wow. Which is obviously the next step. Yeah. And every parent says, wait as long as you can to introduce that, which I get for sure. Yeah.
Was it a big transition? Because my daughter right now, I think she's on the verge of starting to crawl. She hasn't really started yet, but she like gets into position. Yeah. Sometimes she'll like do like the swimming motion. Yeah. Was it a big transition going from being a father of a immobile child to a child that's suddenly crawling around all over the place?
I would say when she was able to sit up on her own, where she can sit with like her head up, I felt like that was the best. Because you could like put her on the ground and she'll play with something, and then you can like do other things. Yeah. When I realized, like, we were excited when she started crawling, but I realized now that she's crawling, it's a lot harder to manage different things, right?
Because you have to baby proof everything,
and you have to just keep your eye on. Right. Like full transparency. We were coming back from New Orleans for like a little trip that we had, and I was packing in the hotel room all of our stuff, and I was playing with Umbi on the bed, and then she was kind of laying on her back, just kind of chilling. And so I was like, okay, you know what? I'm going to try to pack some stuff as she's like more relaxed. So I turned my back and I started to pack on the other bed. Mimi comes out and she just yells. She's like, Andrew, watch out. And then I turned, and then she had crawled and face first onto the ground.
Oh no. Yeah.
She like face first onto the ground, her legs like scorpioned behind her, and just immediate crying. And she had a little like rug burn on her nose. And I was just like, oh my gosh, I feel like the worst parent ever. But the funny thing is, every parent says they all fall. Yeah. So I was like, okay, I feel a little bit better. But
you know what's funny? That's a really familiar story because I have an older brother who has two daughters now. Yeah. But his first daughter, he lives in Korea, but he moved here and he was visiting my parents. Like, they met up in New York, and so they were in a hotel room, and it's almost the same exact thing happened. They left the baby on the bed. Baby rolled over and fell face forward onto the ground. Yeah. Apparently she cried for like hours.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So it's gonna happen. Yeah. It'll happen.
Yeah, and they're both fine, right? Your daughter's fine. My niece is fine.
You still feel bad. Yeah. You still feel like the worst dad in the world. Yeah, absolutely.
Wow. Yeah, you actually might know my brother. He's 2 years older than me, and he went to Northview as well. You guys might have been in the same class. Do you know a Richard Shin? Maybe not.
Maybe.
Okay.
It was some time ago.
Right.
Yeah, maybe with a picture. Possibly with a picture.
After the podcast, I'll show you. But so wow. So as a father, do you have any advice because I think your situation is very specific and unique, right? Because not only do you have to get over the trauma of what happened in your first pregnancy, but now you have to struggle, because you kind of alluded to it. You have to juggle the fact that you're bringing this new life into the world, but also you don't want to completely override what happened before. So what's kind of the biggest thing that you think in your toolbox that's helped you navigate all that?
I think for the biggest thing that I know is of my church community, right? Wow. And that's kind of cliche as a pastor to say, but I think in reality, because of being on staff at our church and everybody knowing Mimi, because our church is still relatively small, everybody knew she was pregnant. And then we go through this loss on Tuesday. We missed church that Sunday, but we ended up having like kind of a small funeral service for our family after the service later in the day, just later in the afternoon, which was really hard. But then we ended up coming back to church the following week, just so that, we can share with the community, right? Hardest Sunday of my life. But at the same time, having that many people and having actually just people caring and making sure like, hey, their intentions were great. Sometimes they would be overbearing or whatever it is, you kind of have to deal with that. But having that community really helped me kind of deal with the first part. But then when the second one came in, like that story and that experience that we've all shared, we were able to kind of lean into each other. Wow. And so I would say, like, for me, it's like parenting ought not to be just you and your wife and your kid, right? The more people that you can kind of bring into your family and giving them the space and the authority to say things to you about kids or about marriage or other things like that, like that would probably be my biggest advice, because I think the moment everything just becomes so insular, like just here, like, man, blind spots are formed. You start to develop this narrative. This is what my family's supposed to look like. And you don't care what other people are thinking and other stuff like that, that can really be detrimental in the long run. That would probably be my first kind of word of advice. Right. And I think the second one is probably, and I hear it a lot, but I would say like not taking it so seriously. And sometimes I might go too far in that direction where it might feel like I don't care about my kid, me and my wife really struggled through this a lot, because I wanted to make sure that when my daughter kind of moves on, it's just going to be me and my wife. Yeah. And I struggled the last quarter of 2019 on making that a priority. And that was a struggle that me and my wife had to deal with and had to struggle through about, still being a married couple. Yeah. And I think part of it was because we were taking too many other things too seriously, and obviously you want to take care of your child, but at the same time you want to take care of your spouse and so on and so forth. And I've talked to Mimi about like her getting married or her going off to college and stuff like that. And I want that to still be very true in our relationship, because I don't want that to be a surprise. Right. I'm like, if she wants to get married at 24, I was like, let's do it. That's fine, But my Mimi's like, she won't know anything at 24. I was like, you're right. You're right. But yeah, those are probably the two big things. I see. So, not easy to do. Right. But I think very valuable.
Do you think having that community consistently, right, with the first, having that community around you when the first pregnancy happened and when the second pregnancy happened, do you think that helped, that continuity?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, for sure. Because we couldn't hide from it. And I think a lot of times, for good reasons, I'm not saying, if this is your process, like it's a bad one, but I'm not saying that at all. Right. But I knew for us, because people knew and people were so close in that sort of narrative, that because I couldn't hide from it, I needed to kind of like face the music. I needed to face people. I needed for us to have this conversation and deal with the awkwardness of like, hey, I saw you were pregnant. Like, how old is your son now? I was like, we have, instead of avoiding that conversation, just taking it on head on. Right. And I think that happens when you have a strong enough community around you. Yeah. To be able to kind of weather those battles, like emotional battles, right? Of dealing with that conversation, of being reminded of it, right? And so, it was definitely helpful having one continuous That's group. Good. And for us, honestly, our church community is the people we see most. Right. Once a week, 52 weeks. Like, I don't know if I see my best friend that frequently, you know what I'm talking about? But I'll see the same 50 to 60 people sometimes twice a week if like we have small group or something like that.
Right.
And so we made a conscious effort to say, you know what, these are the people we see most. So these are the people that we're going to lean into. And so when that happened, like those were the ones that we really leaned into and really looked to kind of help build us back up.
Oh, that's so good.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
So I know you have stuff going on after this, so I'm going to try to keep a good disciplined timetable here. But so one of the secret agendas I had bringing you on here was to try to convince you to start the Growing Family podcast back up.
Consider convinced. Now we're back on. Yeah.
So you mentioned that you were already considering it. So can you kind of tell us about what you want to see happen on your podcast in 2020?
Yeah. So moving into 2020, I guess the whole idea of it, and for me, the podcasts were always going to be in seasons because I realized families move in seasons.
Yeah.
You have like the newborn, and you have so many different like times when you can kind of bookmark and saying like, okay, this chapter's kind of closed. And so as our daughter's turning 1, it kind of gives us a good chance to recap on some stuff and, you know, talk through. It's a good place to kind of restart.
Yeah.
And so I've been kind of brainstorming about it. And usually around this time, January, February, is always the one that kind of brings me back to this sort of area in my life, podcasting, family and our kids and so on and so forth. And so because of that, it's definitely something that I'm looking to relaunch sometime this month, talking with my wife and kind of, you know, reestablishing our content and reestablishing audience and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
And so that'll be coming soon in the next couple of weeks. And I think moving into 2020, there was a lot of ideas that I wanted to get into when it comes to family, especially as Asian Americans. And so a big one always is going to be infertility, miscarriages, loss, and being able to hear from people's experience on how they dealt with it, right? And knowing certain couples who've been trying for close to a decade and having kids and dealing with loss after loss, and the financial burdens of that, and what does it feel socially? You know, that area of conversation is something that we've always wanted to get into. A big topic for me is talking through blended families because I think we are a unique generation in that we won't have to deal with the language issue. Like we'll never, like our lineage from now on will never have to deal with the language issue, right? Like the differences between us and our parents. And so because of that, now you have much more blended families. And so one of the chapters or parts that I want to kind of talk with is like, how do families with Chinese and Korean backgrounds, like how do you decide to raise children? Even though we have similarities, there's still a lot of differences, right? Not even that, but like biracial and families as well.
Right.
There was an episode that I wanted to do and still kind of in the works logistically of non-Koreans husbands marrying into Korean families. What is that? Because there's a few people that I know really close who are both white and black who both have Korean wives. Okay. And they're entering into that sort of world. Yeah. And what does that look like for you? And what does that look like for you and your own personal ethnicity? Right. Your own heritages and stuff like that. Yeah. And so there's those topics that I kind of want to get into. And then obviously just some fun family things. Yeah. And Mimi has developed some tips and tricks and things that I feel like are hugely valuable that we want to share, like kind of our Amazon top 10 things that we've found for new parents and stuff like that. Yeah. And
my wife would love that.
Oh, yeah. I'll give you some after this. And, there are things that we kind of figured out for us, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Like we're very pragmatic in our approach. So because of that, we've gone through a lot of different iterations and stuff. So okay. So we're looking to really kind of launch it in the way in which I'd originally hoped, but obviously it comes with some context. Right. And so, we're looking for that in 2020. And I think I'm ready to allow for that to still be the part of our story, but not necessarily be the topic of the next season. Does that make sense? Yeah. So now that we're like 1 year into it, now we're new parents, and now we're kind of moving into this growing family.
Wow.
In the traditional sense.
Right.
So,
right.
Yeah.
I'm really looking forward to it. And it's been a treat for me to have you on, because I would say you were one of the inspirations for me even having started the podcast.
Wow.
Seeing that there are people locally doing podcasts.
Yeah.
It just kind of gave me subconscious permission to do it as well. So thank you so much for being on. Thank you for doing your podcast.
No, you're welcome. I will shout out in the same way you did. A big kind of push for me was also John Song.
Oh yeah.
And I know that he came on.
Yeah.
And you said that he's like kind of a local celebrity.
Yeah.
He very much is.
Yeah.
Right. Like only really like if you grew up in Atlanta and if you're creative, like he's gonna be the champion of whatever creative that you're doing.
For sure.
And so when I was kind of throwing it out there to him, he was like, "What can I do to help you make this true?"
Wow.
And I thank him because he's always been a inspiration for me as well. And I've actually known him since middle school as well.
You know what's funny? After our podcast that I did with John, he was telling me about how for his Watts cast that you and Mimi recorded with him.
Yeah.
And he was saying how you guys had known each other forever.
For a while. Yeah. It's been a journey. And so he truly is that local celebrity though.
Yeah. No, and I want to throw it out there too. I mean, I don't really have a lot of expertise, but just because I've done this for a year, if there's any way that I can help you, whether it's mentioning it on my podcast, whatever it may be, please feel free to reach out. Yeah.
And so for people who are interested, it's the Growing Family podcast. That's the title of the podcast. It's a handwritten or a hand-drawn tree. I got to change. I know you're doing a new logo, so I got to do something.
Okay.
I got to really invest into it as well. And so, I think it's up on iTunes. And so for people, I think all the seasons are still up there.
Yeah, it's on Google Podcast as well.
Okay,
that's
great.
What I listen on.
Oh, wow. That's great to know.
Yeah.
And one thing we always like to share is we made a joint email because of it. So if anybody is going through sort of this experience or have gone through it and haven't had a chance to process or wanted to kind of talk through it, please feel free to reach out to me. Our email is songfam, SONGFAM 1986 at gmail.com.
Okay.
I remember I first did that and Mimi was like, "Why are you giving people emails?" I was like, some people might want to reach out, it's just one of those things. And there was like one or two folks who have kind of emailed and connected with us, which was a huge blessing as well. And so again, please, we'd love to connect, even if you feel like, will they talk to me as a stranger? Absolutely. I feel like these experiences are what ultimately like knits people together.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things where if you've gone through it, the pain. Yeah. And so it's one of those things that we hope we can be a blessing to.
Yeah.
So Growing Family Podcast, songfam1986 at gmail.com. Feel free to connect. I believe the podcast is still up, and hopefully sometime in January we'll come out with, it would be season 3. And hopefully 2020 will be the one in which we really intended for the podcast to look like.
Wow.
So,
okay. Wow. That's so awesome. So guys, definitely look forward to that podcast, because I'm going to be listening to every episode. Andrew gave his email, so please, if you have any feedback, anything that he talked about resonates with you, please reach out to him. If you want to reach out to me, my email, IHTHT @gmail.com, or Instagram, that's I hope they hear this, or on Twitter at IHTHT podcast. And I will say this, having an Instagram has really helped get feedback.
It's good to hear.
Yeah, most of my feedback has come through Instagram direct message.
Okay.
So you might want to look into that too.
Sure, yeah, we'll do. Yeah. Thanks.
But again, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
This conversation was so eye-opening, and I'm just really glad I got to meet you.
Fantastic. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thank you guys, and we'll talk to you guys next week. Bye.